All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to First Novel Experiences. I sort of have to amend that because John, the gentleman at the end, has written a nonfiction book, but it has a narrative arc, I am told. Somebody was supposed to introduce all of us, so I guess what we're going to do is we're going to go down the line, introduce ourselves, and then we'll start talking about the ways in which our lives have changed or not changed after putting our first books into the world. My name is Don Waters. I'm the author of a short story collection called Desert Gothic, which won the Iowa Short Fiction Award, and I have a brand new novel called Sunland. Both are primarily set in the American Southwest.
Okay, my name is Tracey Garvis Graves. I'm from Des Moines, Iowa, so just a couple hours that way. I'm the author of 3 novels. Actually, one is a novella, but I wrote On the Island and Uncharted, which is the accompanying novella. And then I have a brand new book that just came out last month called Covet.
Hello, everyone. My name is Whiti Hereaka. I'm from New Zealand. I live in Wellington in New Zealand. I wrote my first novel, came out in 2010, and that's called The Graphologist's Apprentice, which is hard to say, so I should have changed the title. And my second novel, Bugs, has just been released mid-September.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bruni. I'm from Chicago. I live in Brooklyn now, and my first novel was published this July, and the title is The Night Gwen Stacy Died.
Okay, my name is John Havick. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was a college professor for 30 years, and I wrote much when I was doing that job, but then this is a book that I wrote afterwards, and so this is kind of my first effort at something that's not very academic, but it took on many of the same things that a fiction book would have. I worked on my characters. They were nonfiction characters, but I had some of the same problems, I think, of a fiction writer.
Great. Thank you. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a short discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. Something that I've actually run into a lot are 2 primary questions about first novel writing or first book, which is, what is the origin story of your story? Why exactly did you want to write this specific tale? And the second is, how did you get your book published? So we'll get to that part, the nuts and bolts, sort of at the end. But I'm really curious about why everyone here wrote their specific tale, their specific story. Was it something from your own experience? Is it something that I'm just really curious. And so, Sarah, I'm going to start with you because you based the first 50 pages of your novel in Coralville.
I did, yeah. So the way that this came to be a novel is maybe sort of strange. I didn't conceive of it as a novel at all when I wrote it. I wrote a collection of short stories that mostly took place in Chicago. One of those stories took place in Coralville, Iowa, and when I tried to sell my collection of short stories, editors who were not willing to take it on suggested that I take this one story that was set in Coralville and blow it up into a larger narrative, a novel. And so it was really interesting for me at the time then to come back to the short story that I had written when I was much younger. And it's interesting for me now to be walking around Iowa City and driving around Coralville because my imagined world that I've been living in with this book for the last 6 or 7 years is so different, of course, from what I see now. So yeah, I mean, it definitely grew out of personal experience in some ways because I was drawing on, lived experience in Iowa, but then also in Chicago later. And I guess I'll leave it there and maybe talk more.
Yeah, great.
People jump in.
So Tracey, I'm wondering, your first novel is On the Island, which is right here. And I'm curious because the book is about this older woman and a younger man, and they there's a plane crash, and then they find themselves on this deserted island. So, how did you come up with this?
Yeah, I know. I get that a lot. On the Island was honestly just conceived of my desire to cross an item off my bucket list. I had never written a novel before. I wanted to see if I could write a novel. And so many people say they're going to do it, and the trick of it is to actually do it. And so I thought I would challenge myself to see if I could actually do it. And because I had absolutely zero expectations, I didn't have anybody waiting for this novel, I just decided I would write something really fun that I wanted to read. And I love the desert island premise, and I felt like this would be sort of a unique pairing, in that if I was going to put two people on this desert island, I should probably make them be two people who should never, ever be together, and then see what would happen if I did that anyway. So that's how that came about. And people look at you really weird when you tell them that.
Great. Whiti?
Oh, sorry. So the graphologist apprentice kind of came about because I was working at a department store at the time, and we had an older customer who was a shut-in. So she'd ring us up and ask us to send birthday cards to Prince Harry when it was his 21st birthday, or just crazy things like that. So I started to wonder about this older woman and what her life was like and why she was sending out these cards. So a graphologist, if you don't know what graphology is someone who studies people's personalities through their handwriting. So I came up with the idea that there was a character who was kind of mining for people's personalities, so she could write her magnum opus about graphology. And kind of stuck to that was the main character, January, who's a young woman who has kind of no idea what she wants to do with her life, and she meets a woman who's very passionate about what she does. So that's kind of two things that came together. And I was also just interested in a story that I should say that I'm a playwright before I was a novelist. So I was interested in a story that I didn't think would translate well onto the stage, because it's very internal. So that's why I thought it'd be best as a novel.
Great, thanks. And John, the gentleman at the end, he wrote a nonfiction account of early NASCAR race car driving in the Midwest.
Well, they were. It was a local track in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and I followed the racing for 4 years or so during when I was a grade school kid, and then I kind of forgot all about it. But these were, and one of the drivers bought my grandfather's car off a used car lot and raced it, and that wouldn't be much of a story, but these three people turned into some of the best racers in the nation. And that made it more of an interesting tale. It's a rags to riches tale almost. They started very modestly, kept getting better. There's a lot of ethical issues that go through this book. And so it's a number of things besides just a racing book. And much of it is set in Iowa, and then they get in the big time. And at the end, there's 6 chapters about how the first Daytona 500 was probably not decided correctly. So I have a hook. I have a nice hook for the book.
Great. Thank you all. So I'm wondering now, how have your lives changed now that you have a book in the world? Have they changed? And also, I'm also curious about what sort of problems have you encountered? Or maybe even before you published the book. Because, it's great to publish a book, but there's also so many ups and downs. So I'm just really wondering, have your lives changed at all? Or was this sort of something you were working for a long time? You published the book, and now you're just moving on, publishing another book? Or are you sort of resting on your laurels? Sarah?
No, I don't think I'm resting on my laurels. I don't think my life has changed much at all. I think that I thought maybe that it would. I think that for someone that spends a lot of time at a young age thinking about becoming a writer and the act of writing in this certain way, you imagine that having that first book out in the world will make an enormous difference. And I don't really think it does. The work is still there, and it's still a challenge. And I think it's a challenge in a different way because after having a first book come out, you're sort of reacting in a way against what already exists in the world. And so there's that to contend with, which isn't an issue the first time around.
Great. Tracey?
One of the ways that things have changed for me that is probably the most important and the thing I love the most is that I now can write full time, When I wrote On the Island, I wrote every day between 5:30 and 7 a.m. before I went to my full-time job, and I did that every day for a year until the book was done. And now I don't have to do that anymore, so now writing is my full-time job. So I'm just extremely grateful that I can get my kids and my husband out the door every day and then close it and have just the dog and me and the silence, because that's what I really need in order to write. I think that the hardest thing about my sophomore novel, which just came out last month, is that you're no longer in that little place where nobody really has any expectations. There are a lot of expectations now, and I always swore that I would be the kind of writer that would not write the same book over and over and over. But with that comes some challenges. I don't write series, I write standalone novels, so every time I write something, and I did have a companion novella to On the Island, but every time I write something now, it's probably going to be judged either against the first book I ever wrote or the one that came before it, or possibly all of them. So that's something I think that I'll have to sort of work with from now on, and I don't think that's something that is unique to me. I think once you decide to write that second book, that's what you're looking at.
What about you, Whiti?
So like Tracey, to write my first novel, I would get up stupidly early in the morning and write, and then go to work. So my life had to change. I was working all the hours I could at the department store to make ends meet. So I went and found a better job, and so I could work part-time and work on writing. So I guess that's like a big change in my life. But actually publishing the book, to me, hasn't really changed my life. For me, it was more in the writing of the book, the process of writing the book. I shouldn't say this, but I guess I don't really care how it's disseminated into the world. Which makes my publisher go, no, don't say that. So yeah, for me, it was actually writing the book itself that changed my life, because it proved to myself that I could write a novel. It's taken me, I think, almost 3 years to say that I'm a published author without laughing. So yeah, that's probably a big change. John.
I tell you, I walked into the Council Bluffs Public Library about a week ago, and I'd done some research there for the book, and the librarians really treated me nice. It was amazing. And then I went up to one of the towns where these racers were in Harlan, Iowa, and I bet there was a crowd. It wasn't quite this big, but there were a lot of people, and they'd come one from Denver, and they'd come from all over. And we only had, it was a library, and we only had 20 books. I brought those as a favor, just to sell and give away. I had to give some away, the people who helped me. And the crowd got a little hostile because they couldn't buy books. I think I could have probably sold off 20 or 30 more books there that night. And I just did it for favor. So, yeah, it's a little different. I think it isn't, there's some interesting things that happen when you've written a book.
I always like what Joyce Carol Oates had to say about it, that you could, as an author, get a fantastic seat at a restaurant, but when you were there, nobody knew who you were. So, Tracey and Whiti, you both touched on something I want to talk about, which is work, because there's the writing work and then there's the day job, and those two seem to always be in conflict. And I know with myself, I'm one of the writers who have had so many different types of jobs. I've worked at a mock jury company where we went around the country doing mock juries. I've worked as a director of an elder care center when I lived in Berkeley, California. I've worked as an environmental advocate. So I mean, I'm sort of this guy who sort of goes around lots of different hats, has these jobs, but in the meantime, I'm writing. And I'm always, reaching toward that goal, forgetting where Tracey is, but I know that the type of writing I do might require some sort of academic job or something like that. So I wonder if you guys could talk about, the day jobs that you have, or what you had while you were writing your books. Are you, going to rely on books forever, or do you think about the future? I'm just really curious about how people support themselves. I mean, it's a really big question with writers. Sarah?
I'll start. Yeah, so I have worked a series of odd jobs pretty much my entire adult life. One of them made its way into my novel. One of my first jobs was as a gas station attendant on the Coralville Strip, which ended up figuring largely into the first major thing I wrote. I've worked in a lot of cafes and restaurants. I've worked at an upscale optical eyeglass shop. Now I've been doing more things that are related to writing. I'm a copy editor and I teach creative writing classes. And I think that it's become more important to me the longer that I'm doing this, that whatever else I'm doing on the side of writing has a social component, just because writing is such a solitary pursuit, and we just spend so many hours alone in these interior created worlds, that I've found there's really not much to write about when you're spending the same amount of hours copy editing or laboring over a sentence in a different way. So I feel like looking forward, something social and something in various communities is important to me to sort of balance the solitary work of a writer.
I had actually been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years, and then when my youngest child went back to school, I decided that I would go back to work, and it was really important for my husband and I that one of us was home when the kids got home from school. And so I was very, very fortunate to be able to get a contract position with a local, very large mortgage company in Des Moines. And so I worked in the human resources department. I had been an IT recruiter before I started our family. And so I was lucky enough to get a job in the human resources department of Wells Fargo, and I was hiring people to work in their mortgage departments, mostly mortgage underwriters. And so the nice thing about that is that it allowed me to be home. I could kind of set my own hours and be home when the kids got home from school. And since it was a contract position, I just worked during the school year. So I worked during the school year, and then I was home during the summer. And I actually drafted a large part of On the Island when I was home that summer, and then spent twice as long, if not a little bit longer, during the revisions, doing the revisions while I was back to work full time, which is why I wrote so early in the morning. So I envision writing full time forever. I don't ever see going back and trying to balance a full time job with writing, and I'm really happy that it looks like I'll be able to do that.
So I work part-time at a ministry department for government in New Zealand. I'm very lucky because I work for the Culture and Heritage Ministry, and they're very supportive of what I do, obviously. So I get a taste of full-time writing. I'm here at the moment for the fall residency with the IWP. But like Sarah said, I need to see people, and having a part-time job seems to fulfill that for me. I'm not sure if in the future it will be the same job. But yeah, at the moment that seems to fulfill my need to talk to people. And I think I'm a playwright first, so I'm stealing people's dialogue. So if I can't hear other people talking, then...
My advice is, if there's anyone out there thinking about it, do not quit your day job. It's a long shot, and even if the books are published, making a lot of money, it's not easy. And I'd retired, and so I had money coming in, and I must have worked 8 years or so, not full time, but just on this book. Sometimes I get discouraged and take a couple months off. But it's not a. You have to be pretty tough to do this job. These people don't look real tough, but they probably are.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So I think that we should start talking about the paths to publication. And I know that we have some interesting stories here on the panel. Tracey self-published her first book, which was then picked up, and I want to start with you. But also, Whiti, you were a playwright, and a publisher actually approached you and wanted you to write a novel, which is usually it's sort of the other way around, where you're trying to hoist the novel onto them. But I'd love to hear how everyone their experiences, starting with you, Tracey.
Okay, well, don't let me take too much time.
Okay.
I feel like my story could get really long.
No, I'm actually really fascinated by it.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, I wrote On the Island because it was just a book that I wanted to write, and I wanted to see if I could cross that item off my bucket list. But somewhere along the way, when I was nearly finished, I changed my goal a little bit because I knew that I was going to make it. I knew that I was actually going to finish the book. And then I started thinking about, well, what should I do with this book? And I knew it was really, really hard to break in. And so after I finished the book and it went through my beta readers and my critique partner and revisions and polishing and all of those kinds of things, I got really excited and I started to draft the perfect query letter because that's how it works. You have to obtain literary representation by an agent, and then that agent will shop your manuscript around to the publishers, and hopefully a publisher will love it and they'll buy it and your book will be published. And so I queried those agents, and I was very, very excited because surely they were going to love the book because the people that were reading it said that they really liked it, and so why wouldn't they like it? And that was so naive of me because they rejected me 100%. So I had every single agent that I queried sent me back a very nice and rather fast form letter saying, we don't want anything to do with your book. We don't even want to read it. Because they're not reading it. It's just a letter you send them sort of asking them if they might like to read it. And you want to make it sound really enticing so that they'll say yes, but they all said no. And so I was really crushed because I just couldn't understand, although I can completely understand now. But at that point in time, I was just really kind of down about the whole thing. I was still very excited about accomplishing the goal. And my husband and my critique partner said, you could self-publish this if you want. And I said, yeah, I know I can. And self-publishing had come a long way from selling books out of the trunks of your car, but it still really felt like I had failed, and I was embarrassed. I was just, I was kind of like, the whole industry I'm trying to break into they really don't want anything to do with me. And so finally my husband said, well, you can either let this sit on your hard drive or you can self-publish it. And so I kind of came around and decided that, I didn't really have anything to lose at that point, and I'd already started my next book, and so I took a couple months and I hired, basically on a freelance basis, everything that a traditional publisher would have done for me. So I hired a developmental editor, and I hired a copy editor, and I hired a formatter, and I chose my own cover image, and I wrote my product description. And so I did all of those things, and when they were all done, I went ahead and uploaded in September of 2011, I uploaded to Amazon and Barnes & Noble's self-publishing platforms. And then I also distributed it through Smashwords, which allowed it to be available on iTunes and through Sony and Kobo and Diesel. I did a paperback release, and I also did an audiobook. So I felt very strongly that it should be made available in every single format that I could, because the hard part was already done. The book was already done. So once all of those things happened, I just kept going to my day job every single day, and I was extremely excited when my husband would get home from work every day and say, how many did you sell today? And I would say, we sold 4 copies today. And, and he was always very proud, and I was very happy because, it was out there at this point in time, and there wasn't really anything else I could do about it. So long story short, 6 months went by, about 5 months actually, and the book had just continued to sell more and more each month than it had the month before. And I was starting to get a lot of really nice emails from readers. Bloggers got a hold of it in probably December, and they started kind of shouting about it. And since it had sort of a risky storyline, a lot of people, I think, were very hesitant to read the book, even though maybe that was a misstep on my part, because once they actually read it, they realized that, oh, okay, what I was worried about didn't actually happen, and I love this book, and it's very uplifting. And so the turning point came for me in March of 2012. Amazon wrote to me and said, we'd like to feature your book in one of our upcoming promotions if you are open to this. And I was absolutely open to that. And they did, so they featured it along with 199 other books in a promotion called The Big Deal. And so at the end, and it was an 8-day promotion, and I was just over the moon at that point in time because it was starting to get a lot of really good buzz, and I was starting to sell about 100 copies a day, and that just thrilled me, and I was so happy. And so then this promotion happened, and at the end of the promotion, it was at number 9 on Amazon, and I was really, really excited by that time. I didn't think it could get any bigger or better for me. It was just, at that point, kind of exceeded all my goals, and then things got really, really crazy. It stayed in the top 10 on Amazon for the next 2 months, and it was up there with The Hunger Games and the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy. and Nicholas Sparks, and then me with my little self-published book. And so those agents that didn't want anything to do with me got really interested all of a sudden. And they started sending me emails and wanting to know if I wanted to discuss representation, and it was all very overwhelming because I was still going to my job every day. And I did end up signing with an agent. It was one of the agencies that had rejected me, although not this particular agent. No hard feelings. I understood that it was business, and at that point in time, I needed some help because I had been getting some requests from foreign publishers to publish it in their country, and I needed somebody to handle that for me. So I went ahead and signed with the agent, and they started getting to work on the foreign rights. And then it was a couple weeks after that that it hit the New York Times bestseller list, where it would stay for 9 weeks, which was, again, just something that my brain could not comprehend at the time, and still doesn't. And then shortly after that, MGM bought the film rights for a feature film, and so that was really super exciting. And then shortly after that, Penguin contacted my agent, and so did HarperCollins, and they both made offers for a 2-book deal. They wanted to acquire On the Island, and they also wanted to publish the next book that I'd already started writing and had been talking about on my blog and my Facebook page. And so they acquired me in a 2-book deal, and then that's the second book. This is the second one in the 2-book deal that came out last month. So it was a really exciting path, but it was a path that I had zero expectations for, and I'm just really lucky that it turned out the way it did.
Wow. Can I have your autograph? That's really fantastic. I mean, from self-published, it says New York Times bestseller on here.
Yeah,
That's fantastic.
it actually sold about 500,000 copies
Wow.
as a self-published
Wow.
book.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No kidding.
So don't give up. That's what I want you to take away from that story. Don't give up if you want to do this. It doesn't always end up like that, but it can.
Great. Thanks, Whiti.
I have to follow up.
I know.
So I'm going to sound like a spoilt brat now. So my publisher, Huia Publishers, are a small publisher in New Zealand who specialise in publishing Māori and Pacific Island work. And every couple of years they run competitions for short stories, novel extract, and short film scripts. So I'd written a silly short film about a soul trapped in a suitcase who was having a discussion about the afterlife with, I guess, a TSA agent at an airport, and decided to enter it, and I won that competition, and from that my publisher approached me and said, please write a novel, and I said no. I'm a playwright, I don't write novels, but thanks for the free wine. And from there, Brian, who works at Huia, kept ringing me up and saying, look, we think you can write a novel, do you want to have a go? We'll provide you with some support, you'll have a mentor. And finally, it's kind of like the bucket list thing. I thought, yeah, I'll give it a go. Why not? And merrily went on my way to write a novel, which I had no idea how to write a novel, and just jumped feet first into it and muddled my way through for 4 years. So that's kind of my story in publishing. It's not that impressive. I don't think. I haven't sold 500,000 copies.
And Sarah, you did you go the traditional, because you're Houghton Mifflin published your book, and so you got the agent and then they sold it, and
Pretty much. I mean, I got an agent. I guess I was fortunate in some way to find an agent who wanted to work with me right out of graduate school. But at the time I was trying to sell a collection of short stories, and they were interconnected short stories, and my agent had just sold another collection of interconnected short stories for a lot of money, so I thought, oh, great. No more problems from here on out. And then, of course, it didn't sell. So that was definitely a huge challenge for me, because this is sort of the place where I felt like all the decisions I had made thus far in my adult life were leading, and I went from having a very strong manuscript to having a manuscript that nobody wanted anything to do with. So it was very hard for me to start again from that moment. I was living in California at the time, and I actually kind of disconnected myself from my life. A lot of the editors, I think I mentioned before, that didn't want to buy it suggested revising as a novel, to the extent that we submitted in rounds, and my agent would come back to me after the first round of rejections and would say, do you want to revise as a novel? And every time I said, absolutely not. I have no interest in writing a novel. This is a collection of short stories. But I found myself, so I left the country for a while and kind of disconnected myself from my life, and I had the intention to start a completely new project, but somehow found myself through my own means somehow back in the world of this one short story that editors seemed interested in, and found myself at that time revising as a novel. And so it was tremendously scary for me to approach. I got back in touch with my agent about a year and a half later with the manuscript, and it was terrifying to submit it again, because we were submitting to all the same houses, many of the same editors, and I was very lucky, I think, to end up where I did at Houghton Mifflin, because I ended up with an editor who sort of reminded me of things in this fictional world that I didn't even remember that I wanted to express. I had been working with some of this material for so long that I kind of needed an outside voice of guidance to remind me what was even interesting potentially about this world. So I feel lucky in that regard.
Great, thanks. And John?
Yeah, I'll give people a few tips, and it all happened to me. So the one thing, persistence, that's the first tip. You have to be able to take rejection. The second thing, if there's, the writers, they have query letters, and they might be sending them to agents, publishers, wherever, which quickly describes in a page what you have to maybe get them interested in reading the rest of it. Well, if you're out there and you've been sending out stuff for a year or so, you better change your query letter. And the third, try anything else with your query letter. Then the third thing is, by then, all the editors have probably rolled over and send it right back to the same publishers. They have interns that read maybe one paragraph and throw the rest away. I mean, it's the kind of business where they wouldn't hardly remember something that they saw 6 months before, particularly if you've changed your query letter. And so, you just have to be very persistent.
Great, thank you, everybody. So we're going to take some audience questions now. Yes, hold on one sec.
Can I ask 2 questions? My first question is, speaking of the query letter, how do you format it now that a lot of the agents want it to be sent in the email? Do you format it like a regular business letter with your address and then the agent's address and then the body of the letter? Or do you leave that top stuff off? And the reason I ask is because a blog I was reading from an agent's intern said that it was really annoying because she would read these query letters on her phone and she'd get all this bare space with these 2 addresses and have to scroll way down. So that's my first question. The second question is, what's the cost of self-publishing, if you dare to tell us?
I'll take both of them since I can answer the second one. You just write it like a regular email. You don't put any of the name, address, or anything like that. Yeah, underneath your name, you want to have either your website or if you've got any kind of platform at all or internet presence, you'd want to have a link to that. But otherwise, you just go out with your normal salutation and then the body of the email and then your closing. So as far as self-publishing goes, and this is kind of a hot button of mine, it doesn't cost anything to self-publish. I'm very, very nervous about the number of people, and there are a lot of them that write to me and want to know what company I use to self-publish. You don't use a company to self-publish. You are the publisher. You upload directly to Amazon and Barnes & Noble through their Kindle Direct Publishing. And Barnes & Noble just changed their program to Nook Press. It used to be called Pubit. There are FAQs on both of their websites. So if you even just put Amazon self-publishing program in the Google search box, it'll come up. Same with Barnes & Noble. Their FAQ will walk you through the steps that you'll need, what format your cover art will need to be, what size. It'll tell you the way you need to upload your actual manuscript, which is why I mentioned hiring a formatter. They're, of course, different. One is a MOBI file and one is an EPUB. And so I had someone do those for me. Now, I did pay on a flat fee freelance basis my editor, my copy editor, my formatter. I bought my own cover image so that I owned the image. But you could, I don't recommend it, you could conceivably self-publish for free if you felt confident enough that you could do all of those roles yourself, which I feel strongly that you have to at least pay for outside editing, at the very least copy editing, preferably both kinds of editing, developmental and copy. But there is no cost. I'm very nervous about the number of companies that are popping up that do, I think, sort of prey on that misconception that they'll do it for you, they'll do everything for you, but you don't need them to do it for you. It took me probably a half hour to upload to Amazon and a half hour to upload to Barnes & Noble and maybe 20 minutes to Smashwords. And most of that's just because you're copying and pasting your product description, or otherwise known as your blurb, and you're filling out a lot of things, your name, your address. You have to give them your bank account information so that they can make deposits into it. So it's an extremely simple process, so there is no cost involved.
Great, thanks. We have another one in the back.
Hi. After listening to all of you, it sounds like there's a combination of both skill and luck involved here. And I wonder if you just have a sense of, I'm kind of curious, do you feel like the cream ends up rising to the top and the good stuff really does get discovered, or is luck that big of a part? I'm just curious.
How do we answer that?
Depends on your definition of the cream. I mean, it's really the readers that are kind of in the driver's seat now, because they can make a book a success just in sheer numbers of the readers that decide to buy it. It's hard to say, but yeah, there's definitely a luck element that goes along with it. When you say?
Yeah. I'd say there's luck for me in getting published, but I'd be writing anyway if I wasn't published or not.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got so many plays that have not been produced, but I'm still writing them. I don't know what that says about me, actually. But yeah, it's hard to say.
But you make your
Who
own
knows?
luck too.
Yeah.
Hard work, I think, luck will follow if you keep working hard, and if you hit a dead end, you just have to find your way around it.
More questions? Yes.
As someone who's interested in writing, sometimes you can be overwhelmed by all the stories that are already out there. You can feel like, why would my story be any more compelling than what's already there? How do you get past that barrier to decide this is worth writing, whether it's published or not? Or I guess that's part of the question. And then the other one is, if you're published, is it easier to publish series books or standalones? Because if you're a standalone writer, I'm just wondering if that's harder to get published because the publishers want series.
So the first question had to do with there are a set number of stories. I feel like the way that I think about it is, yeah, there are a set number of stories and we're all telling them. So what makes each voice unique is actually the way that you're telling it. And I think that's also what makes the writing process rewarding. I think when you're writing in a way where it begins to feel formulaic, you know it, and your reader knows it, and a potential publisher or agent knows it as well. So much of it has to do with, I don't know, just like the nuts and bolts of the actual craft, and less, I think, to do with this is a story about X or Y, because in a certain sense, we're all telling the same stories over and over again. I think in terms of selling books together or separately, it depends a lot on the genre. In my experience, most of the people that I know, writers that I am friends with or have worked with, sell their books one at a time, but obviously that's not the way that it's always done.
I had one thing to add to that if you have any doubt that your story's not good enough or something, you better, you really have to be committed to whatever you're writing, because there's enough discouragement. If you're going to have doubts, even if you have the greatest story in the world, there's going to be a doubt. And then you'll come along with some editor might want you to change the whole book. And I've heard of writers that have adjusted for different editors like 9 times, and then they go pull out the original draft and publish that somewhere. I mean, it just, you really have to be committed to it, your story, and find one like that you're just certain is a great story, and then it's the nuts and bolts.
So I'm a short story writer, and I've been trying to write a novel, and I have found that sort of at about page 120, and this maybe is geared more toward, possibly, towards the women on the panel, but I find these voices like, oh, I really shouldn't take up so many people's time, and this is going on a long time, and all these sort of negative voices that want to shut the project down start to become very noisy. And I was wondering how if you deal with such voices, maybe you all are better adjusted, or if you deal with those voices, and if so, like, what do you do about it?
The inner critic. I don't know, I can't speak for everyone else, but when I'm drafting, I just let that voice, I don't even let it in. I just ignore it. Because you can second guess yourself all the way through the writing of a novel, and that's going to suck every bit of joy out of it that you ever had. So my method that has worked okay for me so far, I think, I mean, it's working well enough that I don't want to change it, is I just sort of get that first draft down very quickly and don't listen to that inner editor or that inner critic telling me that it's a bad idea, because if you've read On the Island, if I would have listened to that voice, that book would have never been written. So don't listen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think every writer thinks what they're writing is worthless at the time they're writing it, and so you just kind of shut it out.
Many different times.
Yeah. So just write through it. I mean, it doesn't matter if it sucks. That's what writing is. You can always go back and rewrite it. Just get it out and go with the energy, I guess.
Yeah, you can't edit a blank page, so just get it down.
And I think also to the point of coming from a short stories perspective, I feel like it can be really helpful to write in fragments or segments that have their own unique sort of life and thrust. I feel like that's been helpful for me, so that if I'm dealing with one character section that I'm completely bored with and I don't want anything to do with, I can move to working with someone else who all of a sudden is interesting to me again, and I'm not completely fed up with him on a given day. So there are ways in which you can sort of trick yourself into becoming interested again by directing your focus to different parts of the text.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
Just curious, Tracey, how many agents did you query before you dropped that course?
Well, I only queried 14 agents, but they were the 14 best fit. And it didn't bode well for me that not a single one of them had asked for a partial manuscript. I mean, a full manuscript request would have been fantastic, but I couldn't even get them to request a partial. So, and writing in the genre that I do, which is kind of a crossover contemporary romance, women's fiction, even action and adventure, there were sort of a limited number of agents. And I had somebody ask me sometime, and they were kind of mad. They said, I just don't understand why you gave up so fast. I just don't understand why you didn't query more agents. But I kind of figured I probably wasn't going to get a different result at that point in time, and that it wasn't necessarily the book because they hadn't read it, but that the premise was probably off-putting and would probably be very hard to sell, because the agent that takes on the manuscript still has to be able to sell it. And after the fact, after all these people read it, then it's like, oh, yeah, we can sell that. But I totally understand at that point in time, it probably would have been an impossible manuscript to sell.
Well, thank you all for coming to our panel, and thank the panelists.
Thank you for moderating.
What's that?
We didn't hear
I was the
your story.
moderator.
We didn't hear your story.
Thanks, everybody.